Welcome to the Social Media for Business podcast, where I am your host, Rebecca Bridgen from Innovate Social, specialists in managing B2B on brand maritime social media. And today we will be speaking with Niki DeBear, Managing Director of Navigate PR, who has a well-rounded career in marketing and PR stemming over 15 years, and will be talking to us to share some insight about managing risk and public relations through their social channels for positive brand outcomes. So first of all, welcome, Niki, and thank you for agreeing to be our third guest, imparting your knowledge to the rest of the maritime marketing community who hopefully will be listening in. So to start, can you give us a brief background on your experience in PR and how social media has changed the way companies manage their reputation?
Yeah, hi, Becca. Thank you for having me on this to start with. Certainly a different thing for me to be doing because I'm generally behind the scenes. You said I had about 15 years experience. It's getting closer to 20, unfortunately.
Well, I was being kind.
It's scary how quickly life moves. And that's purely within the maritime space as well. I was involved in marketing and comms before that, but in different sectors. So I actually came into the maritime industry from a wine background, which is always a good joke and was a bit of a running theme at ABS, which is where I started my career in maritime. Yeah, I've kind of had quite a lot of different experiences, I guess, in the maritime industry in terms of being in-house and an agency. And I've also kind of stepped out of the industry for parts of that time as well. So I worked in a creative comms agency that did a lot of experiential work where I was solely involved with Shell. And I also ended up working in a behavioural science-based comms agency in the UK. So actually doing a lot of work with the NHS. So completely different and actually using a lot more digital marketing in that space than anything I'd done in maritime. So it's been quite an interesting journey, I think, to see the differences outside of our particular space sometimes, because sometimes we're a little bit behind in where some of the technology is and some of the trends. When you and I spoke before we started doing this, talking about the media landscape, social media as part of that, and the sort of general comms landscape and how that's really changed. And I think there's so many things that have happened. And I come from a background where when I started in just purely in the maritime space back in 2008, we were still using fax machines to invite people to events, and social media platforms were banned. We did not use social media as a communication channel. So things have moved quickly. So it's been really interesting to see that change and be part of that. But I think you kind of need to look at the wider context of communications as well and see how technology's really evolved how we communicate. And in particular, from the perspective we're talking about, how that impacts company or organizations' reputations. Because you've moved very much from that situation where it used to be a very controlled mechanism and a very much one-to-many kind of broadcast where the organization or an individual had complete control over the narrative and what they were actually telling people. And it was very much a telling, informing situation. And then obviously how digital communication has really changed that and democratized the communication landscape so that other people have got the tools and the ability to actually be more involved. So it's much more of a two-way process. It's more than two-way now as well, because it's now many to many, because you have the organization talking to multiple stakeholders across multiple platforms in multiple different ways, but you've also got all those stakeholders interacting with each other as well. The really diverse, complex landscape.
Well, I was going to say to you actually, with what you've just said there, in the sense of strategy has changed because you now have that two-way communication. As you said, it's become more complex. I think a lot of companies struggle to manage that, I think, fundamentally.
See, I think we all do. I think it's so much noise. There's so much information being thrown at us. And I can't remember the stats of how much information is produced now on a daily basis, but it's insane. And the speed of which things travel as well. But you've got a situation in terms of social that's really, and the news landscape as well, if we're going back to kind of more of a PR focused conversation, but the way news is consumed is changing. And it's gone from that situation where not just the organization was maybe the one in control of the narrative. You then had big media organizations that then also had this power in this relationship and how we got news, how we got information. And that's being eroded by social. And then even more than that, that's kind of changing even further now as well. So, you kind of see this situation where you used to have news through kind of a few common windows. So you would go to TV, you go to certain newspapers, you might be still using cable, but now it's kind of scattered even within those platforms in terms of chunks that match our kind of age, habits, politics, passions. So you're getting so much more fragmentation than we've ever really had. And the kind of traditional media is really losing its center of dominant power in that space. And social media obviously came in as kind of a replacement for news in that internet era. But even so, that's now declining in dominance as well. And we're kind of splintering into these kind of news bubbles that's really based on, what we associate ourselves with.
Yeah.
And it's all this kind of discussion around the algorithms and what's being fed to you, and that you end up in these kind of bubbles on platforms where you're only seeing content that resonates with your particular views. What that's kind of really meaning is that you're ending up with people who might traditionally sit in the same demographic if you do segmentation in that way, but they're actually getting their news from very different places. The voices that they trust, even the topics and cultural figures that they might follow might be completely different. So it's a really complex landscape, which I think is really interesting, but it's also obviously a massive challenge for brands. It's a massive challenge for any of us that work in this space in terms of how we actually reach those people, the amount of content that needs to be produced, the amount of platforms that you need to have awareness of. It's a really strange and interesting time, I think. I know there was a recent study by Pew and Ofcom, which obviously organisations that UK people are aware of, that show, more people than ever get their news now straight from social media. How we kind of interact with news has completely changed. But it's also now not about publishers and the actual news organizations using social platforms to drive traffic to their websites. They're kind of evolving this whole new ecosystem where they're actually adapting and building their brands with new audiences and users that might not ever go to their homepage or go and read their actual publication. I think it's interesting, but it does mean that there's a huge amount of just stuff. And I think from a maritime perspective, I think really puts into perspective for me is that over the course of my career in maritime, as I said, I've gone from where we didn't use any kind of social media platforms. It was very much traditional media, traditional ways of communicating with people, some slight digital communications, but not really, really at the start of that, to the point now where we've just had the launch, I think of the last week or so, of a platform, social media platform purely for maritime, that's quite a large shift.
Yeah, I think when you were talking about fragmentation, I think, yes, you did used to have the websites and that's where everybody spoke. But now it's almost like the digital marketing space has to branch out and effectively create different shops, as it were, through different social media and it's different social media platforms depending on where your audience is. But I also agree with the algorithm can very much create that echo chamber effect where you are sort of getting a very skewed perspective of a topic. And also then you've got your news. Is it real? I mean, we've got this whole fake news syndrome that is very easy to escalate around social. That's the breeding ground of fake news is social media. So I think the traditional digital space, which is your website, I think still has that place because you will go and you will fact check through the official websites to make sure that actually it's accurate and whatnot. And I think we're becoming wiser to that now, aren't we? So you might see, especially because there's everyone, like you're saying, is trying to attract attention. So they'll sensationalize something and it's like the tabloids, isn't it? You've got the tabloids of social media articles where they'll sensationalize, I don't know, an aspect of that article. And it's not even about, they didn't even say that, but but then you have to go and read the article and just fact check. So I think there's that element there anyway.
Yeah. I think there's lots of issues with trust. It's going to become more and more of an issue because of all of those reasons. But I think as well, it's looking at these kind of behaviours and trends from a wider perspective. And I mean, maybe people go, well, what's that got? What's relevance is that to the maritime space? But at the end of the day, we're all people and we all live in the, the dynamics of the world that we actually live in. That separation is not there anymore. And I think you've seen that in terms of how the visibility's increased of the actual industry itself.
Yeah.
Through the advent of all the digital communication platforms and social media in particular. So and I think to pick up on another piece of research that I've read recently was really interesting and actually really did challenge the perception I had, was there was a recent McKinsey study on B2B behavior, the B2B buyer. And what was interesting about that really was that the B2B landscape is kind of undergoing significant transformation, and that's really fueled by the rapid integration of digital technology. So obviously what we're saying is part of that. But it really shows that the shifts are effectively that consumer-like behavior of modern B2B buyers. So even though you might be doing B2B comms, it should be really doing it as B2C, or there's that segmentation between those two areas just really doesn't exist anymore.
You're still talking to people at the end of the day, and it's people making those decisions. They're just representing a brand. I still think it's done differently to the B2C. B2C is very immediate, isn't it? It's, you click on this and you buy this.
Yeah, the sales cycles and stuff like that would be different, but then that also differs from one business to another anyway. But it's more about the fact that you take your behaviors in your life into your work. And what they've seen is really that a B2B buyer now is expecting to see a seamless, easy to navigate buying process similar to B2C. The actual sale process, the buying process, is now even more prolonged and complex in nature than it used to be. There's more touch points, which kind of feeds back to that thing about actually the entire landscape is more saturated than it ever was. And we've got so many different platforms and different channels and different touch points anyway, that actually then the decision time frame is slower. And that you've also got, obviously, we have to mention at some point AI, which is also transforming, how we do marketing, how we do comms, because it's enabling more of that data-driven personalization and automated engagement. But their thing was really, there was two kind of really key things that came out of the research. And one was around this rule of thirds, which has shown where they've been tracking this particular piece for a number of years. It really now shows that B2B buyers have crystallized their behavior in terms of how they interact. And it's split equally third in terms of remote interaction, in-person traditional interaction, and pure digital.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which I found that really interesting, given the fact that when they actually did the research, this is been bound to be true across all B2B buying. Doesn't matter on the industry, doesn't matter on the geography, doesn't matter on the demographics of the particular buyer. So really, really interesting. It was obviously something that was kind of triggered by COVID, but I think a lot of people thought that there would be some return. Obviously, within the COVID timeframes, there's a lot more than the third split with the remote self-service that's the online piece versus the physical, because obviously you couldn't have the physical. But it's really kind of now settled into this third split, and it doesn't seem to be going back from that, which I was actually quite surprised that holds true across company size, type of purchase, country, industry, etc. I really thought there would be a difference. So it means that the kind of days of the single channel customer have kind of gone as well, and you need to have multiple paths now to interact and reach your customers where they want, when they want. So it's really this omni-channel approach that everybody expects. And that's, I guess, behavior that's coming to our space because this is how you're used to interacting with other brands in your normal everyday life.
Yeah, I mean, you're being conditioned to it. And at the end of the day, we as human beings, we are lazy.
Oh, yeah.
And we want things as easily as possible. And I think that's probably, I mean, I don't know about you, but in COVID, we all bought things online, but it was so easy. And then, you had the whole rise of Temu and, Amazon. I'm sure their figures, probably quadrupled or if that's a real word in COVID, because everyone was getting things delivered. And actually, why would you change back? Why would you go, oh, hang on, actually, let's go to we have to physically go somewhere, and that invests time. And actually, yeah, why wouldn't it bleed into the B2B landscape? So we've covered one of the risks, but I'm going to move into the more risk management, because this is where Navigate PR are sort of really good specialists as well as sort of the overall PR landscape. But I love the fact that you have so much experience and knowledge on marketing, because you really understand it. And I think a lot of the time when, especially, myself, when I have conversations with business owners in B2B and SMEs, is they don't fully anticipate the complexity that is presented in the marketing landscape, and you do, and it's very refreshing. Definitely makes me go cross-eyed sometimes what you can achieve, but an SME can only achieve so much with so many people. They don't have access or the budget for a large marketing team. Go back to the PR. What are some of the biggest risks that businesses can face on social media when it comes to their reputation?
I'd probably frame it that actually the nature of the risks hasn't really changed. So in terms of like where those risks are coming from. So a disgruntled employee is a disgruntled employee. They're just now armed with something that amplify their issue in a completely different way to how they could have done without social, without digital channels. So I don't think it's so much that there's risk so much. You've got inherent risks that are there from doing business. And then the problem that you face because of social media is that there is the speed, the reach, and just the pure amplification of those problems is completely different to how it used to be. You've also got the situation that you've obviously got algorithms that play against you in that space, as well as humans that are playing against you in that space. The algorithms are kind of geared towards promoting negative stories and negative comment. And we all know, or if you've worked in comms for any kind of time, you'll know that I think it's something like you need 15 pieces of good messaging, good stories to counter one single. Well, yeah, because it is human nature. So it's literally how your brain is wired, that we remember negative above and beyond positive. So you have to have so many more positive to counter anything that's negative. So as a human, you're already wired as a bias to that. And then you're playing in a space that's actually leveraging that anyway and amplifying it even further. And it's the speed. I believe that the Titanic disaster was the first news story to make it around the globe in 24 hours. So that was the start of the first 24-hour news cycle. The first time a news story had traveled the entire globe within a 24-hour period. Whereas now, a news story hits and it's around the world in minutes, if not quicker. So you have, I think the risks is more aligned to the speed that you have to respond to things at, and the volume of the reach that you might have to be dealing with.
It's quite stressful, isn't it? Especially for those of you in risk management and PR, because it is really full on, and it also matters with how you respond as well. It's not just about a case of responding with speed, but it's actually doing it in the right way. So my next question, therefore, is how can brands prepare themselves to handle potential crisis before they happen? Is it something that they should have as an armory just in case, as like a first aid kit, effectively?
I mean, there's multiple things that a company or any organization should have in place as good crisis management preparation. But I think it kind of, from this perspective, and we as a company, we've obviously got our sister company, Navigate Response, who deals with the actual crisis management, crisis response part of the whole comms piece as pure specialists in that area. And that's the only type of work that they're involved with, which is It's a real specialism. Whereas my team on the PR side, you're covering more from a risk mitigation perspective. And I think risk management is as a key component of communication anyway, is kind of sometimes not recognized really. But if you're doing your comms right in the first place, then you should be mitigating an awful lot of what might cause a problem for your reputation.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm not talking about things that are coming to you as a crisis from an operational perspective. Good comms is not going to stop a ship sinking, nor does it make it go away either. But maybe the analogy to use is if you do something as an individual that's bad behavior, and there might be multiple reasons why you've done something that's bad behavior. It might not be your fault. It may have been something that was misjudged. The intention wasn't necessarily bad, but you've done something that's bad behavior. If that's the only interaction that you've had with somebody else, they're not really going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And their kind of perception of you is going to be completely based on that one interaction that was not good. So what you want to be doing is building a bank of good interactions with people before something happens, because it cushions that. If you've built relationships with people, and that could be individual stakeholders, that could be organizations that may be impacting your operations license, your license to operate, so regulators, governments, other regulatory bodies. It might be media, it might be customers, it might be employees, whichever stakeholder groups it is. But the more good interactions you've had with those stakeholders, the more likely they are going to be on your side if something does happen that's not good. It also means that you're going to be in a much better position to recover afterwards as well. And that's kind of the message that we always discuss with clients, because there is this kind of perception that if I don't have anything bad, then I don't need to communicate with people, and I can be behind, be very invisible, and that's a good strategy. We'd always say that it's not the best strategy. Things do happen, and it is better to have that bank of good. It's just having that kind of being able to have perspective in a situation, that this is not how this company always acts. This is not actually in character. This is something actually that's an anomaly. But I think in terms of how you can prepare yourself to handle a potential crisis before it happens, it comes back to really understanding your audience and understanding the market and the environment that you're working within. And then we don't really touch on it, but in terms of the social media landscape, to bring it back to that conversation, there is a huge wealth of insight there. And I think sometimes people forget that communication isn't just about pumping out things. It's actually about listening and getting feedback. And one of the really key things that you can do to prepare yourself is to actually really be listening to the environment that you're operating in, so that you actually understand if something is bubbling before it actually turns into a full-blown crisis. So that's more of an area we work in, particularly on the issues management side of things, to actually understand if there is something that's going to become an issue. It's also about making sure that when you are communicating, you're really being authentic to who you are as a brand. And sometimes it's short-term versus long-term in terms of what you're doing as well, or short-sightedness sometimes in the fact that you may engage with behavior or communication that isn't actually going to serve you in the long run, or might get you into quite a difficult situation. But you're obviously having to balance the kind of short-term gains versus what the longer term implications are going to be. And that element of risk management from a comms perspective is really, really important. And I guess to give you an example of what that might be from a maritime perspective is if a brand had gone out very heavily in the early days of LNG, as this is a great future fuel alternative, and now you're in a position where you really want to be leading on a decarbonisation narrative or sustainability narrative, how do you then pivot? So you have to be, and you may even have different parts of the business doing slightly different things, which is always a complex situation for quite a lot of, I think, companies in our space or in industrial spaces anyway, where you might have one part of the business in nuclear, one part of the business in LNG, and another part of the business doing sustainability consulting. And how do you manage all of that when it's literally one company?
I agree. I mean, I think this is probably where transparency comes into play. I think it's never been more hot in the expectations of people is transparency. And social media definitely creates a window for businesses to be transparent. And I think if you hide away from transparency, you will be found out. So it's better to embrace it and plan for that. But going back to, listening to the audience, I mean, within social media, there are tools that is literally classed as social listening. So actually that's a great resource to tap into to really understand that landscape in real time and building that, the good stuff, the 15 points of good stuff. I was thinking that, a lot of companies that are investing in that brand advocacy could build that good feeling, that good vibe through community management. And I think that's where social media has a really key part to play in that is if you have invested as part of your strategy, your social media strategy to fit into your big marketing machine, that community management is part of that. And that's brand to brand as well as brand to individual, then you're right. You're more likely when something negative does come along that you've actually got advocates who will say, well, hang on a minute. Yes, this has happened. But, and then that bleeds into the transparency of they've nothing to hide and they, will openly admit mistakes. And I think it's the communications landscape, you're right, is changing to be honest and real and authentic and raw in real time.
Not just real time, it's also in perpetuity as well. You've got the problem now that when something happens, it never goes away. And then the algorithm is brilliant that once another crisis hits, the stuff that is, in the archive starts reappearing again. So that transparency piece as well is going to come back and bite you in the backside because you can't get away from things that have previously happened. Things get surfaced and you can't quash things. There are strategies you can use to push them down the ratings on Google, which may or may not be ethical practice, depending on what you're doing. But I think if you want actually probably somebody or something that everybody kind of has probably some kind of awareness of, but totally not maritime focused in the slightest, Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift has a brilliant PR strategy in terms of being incredibly in tune with her audience, totally controlling her narrative, even if she's not engaging in it directly, which is quite a difficult thing to do, but really important. And then from a crisis perspective as well, exactly, using her own advocates, her own fans to actually fight her battles for her. So there's quite a lot of information on her approach, and they did her PR team, I guess, did a particular thing when she was under scrutiny for her carbon footprint in terms of them pumping out stories using the same keywords, so that actually when you searched for stories in relation to the carbon footprint piece, you actually got something else. So that's how you can play the algorithm a little bit on trying to sort of change
interesting.
on the search rankings where things are coming up.
But if you get somebody who's hell-bent on finding it, they'll find it, won't they?
They'll find it. And the way you go about that kind of practice as well, you've got to be really ethical, because there's a lot of ethics questions around things like that, because then are you actually being transparent or are you trying to manipulate the information? The transparency question, I think, is interesting anyway, because sometimes I'd argue that transparency is a bit misleading, because I don't think anybody's really, really transparent, because you're always, all of us, nobody just is exactly transparent with everybody, because that's not how we work as humans. You're always trying to kind of maintain some kind of form of persona or perception, even if you don't really know you're doing it as well. It might not be something you're doing deliberately, but a company certainly is trying to manage that image and try to manage that perception. So I think it's more about probably authenticity and then the consistency of the communications and all of the interactions that are really aligned as well. And obviously not saying one thing and doing something else, which then you kind of get into the sort of areas like the greenwashing debate and other areas like that. And I think possibly related really to understanding, again, goes back to really understanding who you are as a brand and then how that relates to your behavior, your comms style, and how you want to interact on various different platforms or in different conversations. And you kind of hope that there was an element of empathy in that as well, in terms of how you understand the stakeholders and that, company has some kind of maybe social purpose, but some kind of purposeful motivation, or they don't want to do things badly, or they're trying to do good for their stakeholders. But then I kind of always am reminded of the CEO of Ryanair, and that it doesn't necessarily hold true, I think. But I would say they're very authentic in who they are as a brand. So I don't think that's really actually ever damaged their reputation, because it's aligned to people's expectations. I think is probably where I'm trying to get to, that if somebody expects you to act and behave in a certain way and you don't, you'll be more penalized than if they've always expected you to act in a certain not great way and you maybe do a bit better.
And from a humorous perspective, you can actually play upon that, even to turn that negative into something quite funny. Like, we know we're not, X, Y, Z, and people are laughing because it's true. That's the general opinion of it. And but you can turn that into a fun thing. So when a PR issue arises on social media, obviously, given what I do, I've definitely experienced this. And you mentioned disgruntled employees, and yes, some of the brands that I've managed have definitely had this in the past, especially when they're reshaping and restructuring. That's quite a common experience. So how do you decide whether to respond? Because sometimes actually the case is best not to. And when do you respond? Do you respond immediately, or do you wait and assess the situation?
I think, again, on this one, it probably comes back to the starting point being really the sphere of influence that the particular person who's posted something has. Like, one of the first places you'd start in terms of assessment to decide whether you're going to go any further with it or not, or leave it alone. If they are, if they've got a huge following, or they're very influential in different ways, then that's obviously going to be something you take more seriously than somebody who's got, 2 followers or just hasn't got the reach. By definition, it's not going to go very far. The biggest problem, I think, that maybe people misunderstand when dealing with negative feedback or negative comments on social media is that by interacting with them, you're already giving them credibility, but you're also adding to the kind of algorithm behind things as well. When you're assessing where something has gone or the engagement with something, well, who actually is it that's really seeing? Is it actually just the comms team who's constantly going in to look at stuff? I think it's a good place to start always is looking at actually the individual who's posted something, or what, in terms of where they are, what that's going to actually do in terms of their sphere of influence, and then looking at it in terms of actually from the root cause, in terms of what's actually happened straight off. Is it actually true? And I think that's another issue sometimes for a comms team, is they may not actually have the correct information. So they may potentially post something in reply that is misleading without intending to be, because they're not being given the correct information to start with. And that's a really dangerous position to get yourself into, which maybe comes back to that transparency piece again. You need to be who you are through the entire piece. You can't start changing your narrative. I mean, you can apologize and you can pivot in that way, although I think quite often that becomes a legal question as to whether you can, because then there's reason that you might be then up for admitting liabilities. There's always that question. But I think if you've seen how people who have dealt with crises and have dealt with it well, it's about taking the ownership of it and clear communication that's proactive. There's nothing worse than something happening and a brand being pointed out that they haven't done anything about it. We've seen that with quite a number of the crises that have happened in the last few years. If the brand's up front And in most respects, if they get in ahead of story breaking and they're the ones that actually break it, you're going to be in a much stronger position than you are if you wait for it to hit the news. I will be very honest here and say that sometimes, though, you are still playing a game of understanding if something is going to hit the news or not. I think you've got to balance being transparent and upfront about things versus putting your dirty laundry in the public arena unnecessarily. And I think that probably comes down to, is it in the public's interest to be aware of what's going on? So I think it's probably a contextual question, but yeah, it's not that cut and dry that you should, anything bad that happens in a company, you should go to your local journalist and tell them everything that's happened. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think it's things that are going to go wider than the organisation, and that there is a public interest to knowing, and things that are probably outside of your control in terms of being able to actually respond effectively as well from a pure operational perspective.
To me, it's very much that the management, going back to, all the content or the comms team looking at it, but I think it goes to the management of the company that happens to be having a crisis to come together, internally, or if they're lucky enough to have a PR team like Navigate, to come up with the best plans and then very speedily then feed that out to the team so they know how to respond. So they're not going to be admitting any liabilities and et cetera, et cetera. I definitely have experienced something like that myself when working for an entity that had a very big bad news that escaped. And I won't go into detail, but the comms team, were very fast, and they came out with, this is actually the story, and this is how we're responding. And actually we were all then, knew the implications, because that's the thing, is not everybody inside of your business is a comm specialist, and therefore don't know the right or wrong way to respond to something. So it's about educating the team internally before said story comes out. And I tell you, when you were coming up with examples, there was one really great example that they handled it absolutely superbly, and it was the RNLI. They've got a fantastic marketing team, so full shout out to them. And there was, I think, a bad news story a good couple of years ago, and the response was phenomenally good, that you couldn't help but continue to love them and admire them. Even they do an incredible job, and they communicate that really well. And in the face of adversity, when I think there was a witch hunt to charities a few years ago, where the public just seemed to want to sort of flog them publicly for anything that could be bad about them. And the RNLI was on one of those lists, and I can't remember what it was about, to be honest. But they were very proactive, and also they came out and they said, we're not sorry actually for it. And it was a really bold move, and they listed all the reasons why they weren't sorry, because we do this, and it was just, and honestly, it was met with such positivity and advocacy from those brand advocates all across the social channels, and it was brilliantly done.
I think you've picked up on something that's really key, that I touched on earlier about the identity piece. You really need to be very clear as to who you are, and don't be afraid of that. And associated with that, you need to know who it is that matters to you in terms of audience, because you're not going to be everything to everybody. And it's a really good example of RNLI really being very clear as to who they are, what they stand for. And then that gives you that compass to really then respond appropriately in any situation, because you have those kind of tenets of how you operate already defined. So you know what your values are, you know what your purpose is, what you stand for, and what maybe you don't stand for. So it really gives you that focus and clarity when you're in a sticky position, but also it should be the kind of core of all of your communications anyway, and marketing activities, that should be all aligned to that. So it's that consistency, and then that is being transparent, because it's all very aligned, and you're not being one thing to one person and you're being something else in a different environment. I think the other massive classic good response to a horrific crisis was the Johnson & Johnson Tylenol case back in the I want to say 80s. It was quite a long time ago. And that was it was a crisis that was caused not by them. The actual situation in the first place wasn't something that had come from an error on their part. But, this was people dying. It was seven people dying of cyanide poisoning. And it's one of those that is always used in any kind of crisis comms situations as, one of the best case studies, because they just took ownership, and they took ownership quickly and decisively. And it's picking up on that identity piece. It was very much tied to their purpose. They had, as a company credo at the time, something along the lines of they work for the good of their customer, then their customer, employee, society or something, and shareholders was the last one. And forgive me if I've got some of the middle ones wrong, but it was definitely customer was the first focal point of everything they did. And that was really then seen in the response, because they pulled the product off the shelves immediately. There wasn't that kind of where we've seen other things where the company has been slower to recall products, slower to do things like that because of the cost implication. And this is not a small commercial decision, but they were very clear on the fact of what's the most important thing to us. The most important thing is the customer, not the shareholder.
And fundamentally showcasing their values, showing their values, demonstrating it. You are going to build that long-term community. Like you said, you've got the short term and the long term. Actually, yeah, okay, there might have been a massive cost associated to that, but in the long run, they're going to have more loyal customers as a result of showing those values.
Yeah, I mean, I think the stock price dropped about 2% after the Tylenol crisis immediately, but they recovered quickly. And they continued to grow, and their reputation for quality and trust was largely intact. And they even, Tylenol eventually even regained its position as one of their top selling products. It's kind of insane when you think about what actually happened, and the fact that, 7 people, including, I think there was children involved, or certainly it was at least a 12-year-old, I think might have been one of the youngest. People taking a painkiller that was laced with cyanide. So, and they did things where they actually changed the product, because I think there was a secondary case of poisoning as well, where contamination of the product, and the chairman or CEO went out quite quickly after that and actually changed the product design. So it was impossible to be able to pull things apart and infiltrate the product. It's just kind of that demonstrating of the listening, being really aware of the audience, being really aware of your stakeholders and what they need. Yeah, being very proactive, very transparent in what you're saying and doing. And I think that's maybe what we're saying about transparency, that it's the transparency in terms of action versus speaking, that those are aligned. It's not that you're saying one thing and doing something else, or not doing anything. That's important. I think you're also talking about things like strength of leadership and other components that come into this as well. It was very clear communication. It was consistent communication. It was proactive, and they really took ownership for the situation. There was no, it's not our fault, which, is kind of irrelevant in that situation. People don't care about you coming out saying it's not your fault whether people have died taking your product. Yeah, it's about that positioning of the message correctly and really understanding, reading the room. There's a time and a place to maybe talk about the fact that it wasn't your fault later. But in the initial stages, the most important thing is actually resolving the situation, but also showing that your company cares about what's happening.
And that goes through to the next question, which we've kind of half covered, was what steps should a business take to rebuild and maintain trust with the audience? It's not just about the immediate after effects of a news breaking. It's actually the actions of what you then do, and then communicating that, look, you are taking action. How do you see the role of social media evolving in the future when it comes to PR for businesses that are just starting to incorporate social media into their PR strategies? What advice would you give them?
I think my biggest piece of advice is that it's not a standalone thing. And I think a lot of companies make the mistake of not looking at things as in a holistic manner. First and foremost, understanding what they're really trying to achieve. I try and make things as simple as possible. I like things being simple. I always like to look at any of this stuff about strategy or how you should be doing certain things is, well, why are you doing them in the first place? Are you clear what you're actually trying to achieve? And that's from both the perspective of the wider, or the total business. So what are you actually trying to achieve from a business perspective? And then how, from a comms side of things, how is the comms going to help you achieve those particular things? Or how can they support in meeting those goals? And that might be, for some businesses, that means actually a really proactive social media strategy may be appropriate. That might really work, because that might actually really target your audience. Because after the initial piece about understanding why you're doing it, you really need to understand who you need to actually engage with, or who you need to communicate to, and what you need them to know or do. And then you need to understand where they are and what's important to them. And then you decide whether actually, what tactic, what channel you're going to use. I think it's more around whether you want social. I know we spoke earlier about actually the Omnicom piece being really, really important now. So you probably do, because you do need multiple touch points that will work together as a seamless experience. But you need to be really clear on who it is you're trying to communicate to and why, where they are, where you're going to be able to engage them. So that really inform then what you do from a social media perspective, because it might be that you really need to be on TikTok, or that you really don't need to be on TikTok, to give a very generic answer to the question, because most of these things you need to actually really know the context and what they're doing and who it is and what they're trying to achieve and who their customer base is, etc., to give a proper answer. But from a very generic perspective, I think that's the advice I'd always give. And then I think we didn't really touch on this so much, but in terms of obviously where the landscape has massively evolved, and we've got this huge problem really that all brands, so I think just individuals anyway, but there's so much noise, there's so much information. Your biggest challenge is cut through and attention. But, I think it was something like you use your phone 3 hours a day of scrolling or something, but you engage with less than 10% of what you see. Our attention spans are reducing. So how do you actually, even if you find the people that you want to communicate to, how do you actually engage with them? How do you get them to stop scrolling and actually read your content or push a button or do something? I think this is going to be more and more of a challenge, because the number of platforms, the number of pieces of content, the number of people is not going down. It's just getting more and more and more. And I think you need to understand what you're trying to achieve from a very holistic perspective. And then that strategy needs to then go across different environments, different platforms, but it needs to all fit together. And you might use some platforms for different things, but it still needs to be aligned. One thing that really gets overlooked when we talk about doing comms, all of the different activities that we can do, the content generation, social media strategy, execution, what you should be doing for your business, what the new trends are, what's the best practice, how to optimize a platform, blah, 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 blah. We kind of miss the resource question. And you can't do everything because you don't have the time, and you probably don't have the skill sets either. The number of different skills required these days it's just increasing and increasing and increasing. And somebody who can write great copy doesn't mean they know anything about SEO, doesn't mean that they know anything about how to use how to optimize LinkedIn performance versus do they know anything about TikTok? It's the kind of the number of skills, or the kind of skill set needed these days is so broad. I don't know how you would really, unless you've got a very big internal team, I don't know how you can actually really meet those expectations. So I think the question always comes back to your objectives, but also your resource and probably your appetite too. Because your objective might be that you want to, increase your revenue by 20% over a certain time period within a certain particular market segment. And you might have various resources to be able to do that. but do you have an appetite to be doing lots of social? It might not actually be authentic to your brand. It might not be aligned with your brand. It might just not be how you do business. So you kind of have to evolve, I think, too. It's not necessarily, you might not go from 0 to 100. So you may start doing a bit on social if you haven't ever done before. And I think that's probably a mindset that's good to be in, is don't have to do everything. Don't be afraid to play and change things or try new things and see if it works. You don't have to do everything that everybody else is doing as well. And I think sometimes we get so bombarded with so much just of what everybody's doing. There's constant information being thrown at us. We all suffer from FOMO. And I don't know about you, but when I start scrolling on LinkedIn, I just get overwhelmed with all the things that I should be doing that I'm not.
Should be
all these
doing.
great
Absolutely.
ideas that I'm never going to have time to. And I lose total focus. And it doesn't make me more productive. It probably makes me less productive because I've just got so overwhelmed by all of this information. I think there is a approach maybe in terms of actually going back to being really clear about who you are as a business or as a brand, what your objectives are, what your resources are, but also being very focused on what you're on those things and what you're trying to achieve, and not being moved from that or distracted from what you're trying to achieve because you're too busy looking at what everybody else is doing. Because I think if you're very clear about what you're trying to achieve and you're actually measuring what you are doing and measuring that so you can actually assess it against those objectives that you're trying to meet, you'll get a lot further, I think, than just constantly looking at what the competition are doing and what everything else. I'm not saying, obviously, that you don't have to have that 360-degree perspective on things, and you need that feedback and you need that insight too, but it needs to be in a perspective that doesn't distract you from what you're actually trying to achieve as well. And for what's right for your business too. Again, it comes back to that balancing act of, you can read the reports, you can understand what the trends are. For example, Edelman did a really great report recently on thought leadership and LinkedIn. The report was in partnership with LinkedIn, so read into that what you will. But, stats can lie just as much as anything else.
Yes, they can.
But that was an interesting piece on thought leadership being a really good tactic to engage with the customers that aren't in the buying process, which is actually an awful lot of people, and predominantly probably your biggest audience, because I think some people
it's 5%, isn't it?
Yeah, are not in the process at any one time. So how do you keep those people still engaged? How do you still keep your brand top of mind so when they do want to engage with the buying process, you're making it easy for them and you're already done half the work? And they were saying that thought leadership really is one of those tactics that works really well. That doesn't mean it works well for everybody. And even if it does work well as a tactic, it's how you implement it that makes the difference to whether it will work for you or it doesn't. And you need to you need to tailor all of these things so it really does work for your particular situation, your particular brand, and your particular audience.
I mean, I agree with all of that. I mean, you were talking about, I'm going back to, so I've made little notes because actually you sort of made me think of different things, the different skill set. Even within social media now, you have different skill set. You have your copywriting, and you're still doing SEO within that copywriting because your posts are found on Google, or you've got your graphic design to make your really on brand visuals. Your copywriter isn't necessarily a graphic designer. So, and you do have your social media manager who might, somebody who can do both, but they're never the specialists of doing that. So you could, go really sort of outsourced and get somebody like Innovate Social that's got all of those, or you could do your social media advertising campaign who, manages that ad campaign. I mean, that's, a bit of dark wizardry that I hire people to do because that's not my personal skill set, but I recognize that. And then you've got, there was something.
Facebook ad manager is a nightmare.
It is. And I personally, and then like you were saying, you've got people who are LinkedIn specialists, like I definitely am more LinkedIn. I will openly admit that. And then you've got other people who are sort of TikTok, and then you've got your video content creators. Your graphic designer isn't going to be able to do that, but you've got somebody who can film, really well. I've got somebody who can do great meta videos, culmination of all the different things. And you have to visualize that as a storyboard, then go and film it really well. Then you've got to put it together and that's in line with TikTok. And that's just on social media. Then you've got the wider machine. So you're right. I mean, bigger institutions have got the luxury of they've got 40 odd people in the one marketing department, but your SMEs generally have your marketing manager that's tasked with doing all of this. And then the business owners who hired the marketing manager, they sort of say, well, why aren't you doing all of this? And the poor marketing managers, sort of, on the floor, broken, and but those that don't know, and this is one of the reasons actually that I wanted to do the Social Media for Business podcast, was to help communicate, the complexity, as well as give tips and advice to help them understand and come up with ideas. And then the marketing manager to go, oh my God, yes, and some tips, practical tips for specialisms that they maybe don't have, that actually they can tap into, you say, Niki. So, which leads me to bring this and wrap this right up, is actually for those people listening, and they might want to ask you questions, or they might go, do you know what? I can see the value in that PR agency, and I can see where the strengths are. And actually we might need something like that. Or I really just want to ask Niki a question after exploring, the topics on here. Where can they find you? Where would be the best place, Niki?
Not on social media. I am quite old school. I am on LinkedIn. It's just ndbear@navigatepr.com. Anybody wants to ask something or drop me a line, I'm always available.
So we'll wrap it up here, Niki. Thank you so very much for being a guest for episode number 3 on Social Media for Business podcast. I have found it thoroughly insightful, actually. And there's been many, many things that I've learned personally as well. And there's been some great examples of great PR, risk management, and social media practices. So hopefully the listeners will find this very valuable. Until episode 4, where we will be talking to, nominated by Niki de Beer herself, the very wonderful Karen Martin, on personal branding and building networks and relationships for sales.
Thanks so much. Bye.